She told me it was the only rule that ever mattered, not the salt across the threshold, not the horseshoe nailed above the barn door, not even the old habit of stopping the clock the moment somebody died in the house. All of those, she said, you were free to forget. Time would forgive you for those. But this one you kept, no matter what, no matter how tired you were, or how heavy the frame, or how good the light looked on that particular wall. Never hang a mirror facing a bed, because the thing inside the glass does not close its eyes when you close yours, and it has the whole night to watch. I want to be honest with you about how this started, because if I am not honest at the front, none of the rest of it will land the way it landed on me. I did not go looking for a ghost story. I went looking for old songs. That was the whole reason I drove up into that part of the mountains in the first place, with a recorder in the passenger seat and a list of names a librarian had given me, people who still remembered the ballads the way their grandmothers sang them before the radio flattened everything into one shape. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. The widow was near the bottom of that list. Somebody had written beside her name, in pencil, in a hand that was not the librarian's, just 2 words: she knows. Knows what? I asked. Nobody would tell me. And in that part of the country, when nobody will tell you, you learn to stop asking out loud and start listening for the answer to arrive on its own. Her cabin sat at the far end of a hollow that the maps had mostly given up on. You drove until the road stopped, pretending to be a road, and then you walked. It was the kind of quiet up there that has weight to it, that presses on your ears, the quiet of a place where the trees are older than every human name that was ever spoken beneath them. And when she opened the door, before I said a single word about songs or ballads or grandmothers, she looked at me the way you look at weather coming in over a ridge, like she already knew what I was carrying and was deciding whether to let it inside. She was old in a way that is hard to put a number on. Her hands were the map of a long life, but her eyes were not old at all. Her eyes were the youngest thing in that room, and they moved fast, and they missed nothing, and the first place they went, before they came to rest on me, was up and to the left, to the wall behind my shoulder, where there was nothing at all except a pale rectangle where the paint had never faded, a rectangle exactly the size and shape of a mirror that was no longer there. I did not understand that yet. I understood it later. By the time I understood it, I had already heard the whole thing, and understanding it did not help me sleep. It has never once helped me sleep. Let me tell you about the mountains first, because the warning does not make sense without them. These are among the oldest mountains on the surface of this planet, older than the Rockies, older than the Alps, older, by hundreds of millions of years, than the bones of nearly everything we call ancient. When these ridges were young, they were taller than the Himalayas, and the sheer patience of time has worn them down into these soft green waves, and there is something about living in the shadow of that kind of age that changes what a person is willing to believe. Down in the cities, we think 100 years is a long time. Up there, 100 years is a nap. The people who settled those hollows brought their old countries with them, folded up inside their songs and their sayings and their fears, and then the mountains kept those things safe long after the old countries themselves had forgotten them. What sounds like superstition in the valley is, up on the ridge, closer to a memory of something everyone else agreed to stop remembering. I should tell you about the drive, because the drive was already trying to warn me. The 2 people I recorded before her, further down the valley, both went quiet when I said whose name was next on my list. One of them, an old man who had happily sung me 3 verses of a murder ballad without a flicker, set his coffee down and looked at the floor and said, "You be back down off that mountain before dark." Not asking, telling. And when I asked him why, he did not say she was dangerous, and he did not say she was crazy, which is what you expect people to say about the woman who lives alone at the end of the worst road in the county. He said, "It is not her you have to worry about. It is what she keeps." And then he would not say another word about it, and his wife came in from the other room and started talking loudly about the weather, the way people do when they want a subject buried, and I understood the visit was over. So I drove up with that sitting in my chest, and the higher the road climbed, the more the world seemed to close in behind me, the trees leaning in over the gravel until the sky was just a thin, bright river overhead. And I remember thinking that this was the kind of place where a person could disappear, and the disappearance would simply be accepted, folded into the general silence, one more thing the mountains kept. I passed exactly one other house on the way up, and it was empty, long empty, the roof caving, the windows black and open like a face with the eyes put out, and I did not like the way it watched me go by, and I told myself that houses do not watch, and I did not fully believe myself. And that was before I had heard a single word she had to say. And the memory the widow carried was about mirrors. She sat me down. She made coffee that could have stripped paint, and she said, "You came for songs, and I will give you songs, but first you are going to sit there and you are going to hear the one thing that is worth the drive, because the songs are just pretty and this is true." And then she told me the rule: never hang a mirror facing a bed. And I did what you are probably doing right now, somewhere behind your eyes. I smiled a little. I filed it under charming old country nonsense, the same drawer where you keep black cats and ladders and broken salt. And she saw me do it. She saw the smile before it even finished, and she did not get angry. She just nodded, slow, like a woman who has watched 100 people make the exact same small mistake, and she said, "That is what my husband thought too." Then she got quiet. And in that quiet, I stopped smiling. Here is what she told me about her husband, and I am going to tell it to you the way she told it to me, because the shape of it matters. They had been married a long time. He was a practical man, a man who fixed engines and mended fences and did not have much use for the old rules, and he loved her. And because he loved her, he mostly tolerated her keeping the old ways in their house, the covered mirrors and the stopped clocks, and all of it, mostly. But there was one winter when they moved the bedroom. The chimney on the old bedroom side had gone bad, and the room would not hold heat, so they shifted everything across the house to the warm side, and in the new room the only good wall for the dresser, the one with the big mirror bolted to it, was the wall at the foot of the bed, facing them, facing the pillows. And she told him, "We cannot put it there." And he said, "It is winter, and I am not recutting a doorway to save you from your own reflection," and the mirror stayed, facing the bed, all winter. She said the first thing she noticed was the dreams, not nightmares exactly. That was almost the worst part, she said. They were not frightening, they were flat, grey. She would wake up feeling like she had spent the whole night standing in a long hallway looking at a door, and the more nights that passed, the more the daytime started to feel like the hallway too. She said she felt watched in a way that had no direction to it. Not watched from the window, not watched from the trees. Watched from inside the room, from the one place in the room that was always looking back. And her husband started sleeping worse. A practical man who had slept like a stone for 40 years began waking at the same hour every single night, she said, the dead hour, and he would not talk about why, except that one morning near the end of that winter he came into the kitchen, grey in the face, and he said a strange thing to her. He said, "In my sleep last night I was sure the man in the mirror was awake before I was." And then he laughed it off, because he was a practical man, but he did not eat his breakfast. And the next morning she covered the mirror with a bedsheet without asking him, and he did not say a word about it, which told her everything. Because a man who thinks his wife is being foolish complains. A man who is relieved stays silent. I asked her, and I remember trying to keep my voice light. I asked her, so what did she think was actually in there? What did she think was watching? And this is the part I have never been able to shake. She did not say a devil. She did not say a demon or a haint or any of the words I expected from a woman in a hollow with covered mirrors. She looked at me for a long moment, and she said, "I do not think it is a what. I think it is a where. I think a mirror is a door somebody built a very long time ago, back when people knew how to build doors like that, and I think we forgot what they were for, and I think forgetting did not close them. Back when people knew how to build doors like that." Hold on to that sentence. Because that was the moment the whole thing turned, and it turned into something much larger than one cold bedroom in one lost hollow, and I did not sleep right for a year after I understood where she was pointing. Let me pull back from the mountain for a moment, because the widow was not inventing her fear out of nothing. She had inherited it, and when you follow that fear backward, out of the hollow and across the water and down through the centuries, you find something that should not be possible. You find that almost every culture on Earth, people who never met, who never traded, who never shared a single word or god or road, arrived independently at the same suspicion: that mirrors are not safe, that mirrors are not simple, that the reflection is not entirely yours. Think about how strange that is. We treat the mirror as the most ordinary object in the house. It is in your bathroom right now. You looked into one this morning without a flicker of fear. And yet the accumulated instinct of the entire human species, everywhere, in every era before our own, was to be careful with them, to cover them, to turn them, to treat them like something that could be left open by mistake. In old European custom, when a person died in the house, the very first thing the living did, before they washed the body, before they sent for anyone, was go through every room and cover every mirror. Sheets, cloth, blankets, whatever was to hand. The reason people gave, when they gave one at all, was that the soul of the newly dead, still loose in the house, still finding its way, might see itself in the glass and be caught there, trapped, held in the reflection, and unable to move on. Or worse, that something on the other side, drawn by the death, might use the uncovered glass to reach through into a house full of grieving, distracted, wide-open people. Go east and it changes shape but not substance. There are old traditions across Asia of never letting a mirror face where you sleep, for reasons that echo the widow almost word for word, that the sleeping self is loose and vulnerable, and that the mirror gives something away to look at it, or to trade places with it. Go further and you find cultures that believed the reflection was not an image at all, but a second soul, a twin that lived in water and glass, and that this twin was not always friendly, and that it wanted, more than anything, to be the one standing on this side. There is a wedding custom, in more than one country, of covering or turning the mirrors before the bride comes home, or of never letting a bride see herself in the glass in her full dress before the ceremony, because on the day when a life is changing shape, when a person is between oneself and the next, the reflection is thought to have too much power, too much say in which version wins. There are traditions that say you must never let a baby look into a mirror before it is a year old, because the baby's soul is not yet fastened in tightly enough, and the glass might take it, or trade it, or simply confuse the child about which of the two of them is the real one. And there are old stories of children who were shown a mirror too young and grew up wrong, quiet, watchful, always turning to check a reflection that no one else could see moving. And then there is scrying, the oldest and most deliberate use of the glass, older than the bright silvered mirrors, done first in bowls of dark water and polished black stone, and eventually in mirrors made especially for it. Mirrors backed in black instead of silver, so that they gave back no clear image at all, only a darkness you could fall into. People used these to see the future, they said, or the dead, or the far away, or the truth of a thing that was being hidden from them. And every single tradition that taught this practice, do not write down protections against a thing that cannot hurt you. The rules were always the same in spirit. Never scry alone. Never scry at night without a light behind you. Never let the mirror see you before you are ready to see it. And above all, when you are finished, cover it immediately before you look away, because the most dangerous moment is not when you are staring into the glass. It is the moment just after, when you have stopped, and it has not. And then there is the oldest and most human fear of all, the one that hides underneath all the others, that the face in the mirror is copying you, that right now it is doing exactly what you do, and it has always done exactly what you do, and you have simply assumed that you are the one leading, that you are the original. But you have never once, not in your entire life, seen the reflection move first. You assume it follows. You have no proof. You only have a lifetime of looking away before you could catch it. The widow said her grandmother put it plainest. Her grandmother told her that a mirror is the only window in the house that looks into a room you are not allowed to enter, and that the person you see in that room has spent their whole life learning to move exactly when you move, and has gotten very, very good at it. And that if you ever want to know the truth of it, you should hang one at the foot of your bed and lie there in the dark and wait. Because in the dark, her grandmother said, it does not have to pretend any more. Now, I could have left it there, A beautiful piece of mountain folklore, a widow, a cold bedroom, a grandmother with a chilling turn of phrase. That is a good enough story. But that is not the story she told me, because right at that point she stood up, and she went to a trunk in the corner, and she took out something wrapped in oilcloth, and she unwrapped it on the table between us, and it changed the entire shape of what I thought I was listening to. It was a fragment of mirror, old, very old, not the flat, bright, silvered glass we know. This was darker, heavier, the reflecting layer behind it a strange, tarnished grey that seemed to hold light instead of throwing it back cleanly. And she said, "My grandmother's grandmother carried this over the water, and she told me that where it came from, they knew how to make mirrors that we cannot make any more, and that this is a piece of one of those. From the old world, the real old world, the one they do not put in the school books, the one they do not put in the school books." And there it was, the door she had been walking me toward the whole time. She slid the fragment across the table toward me and told me to look into it. And I did not want to, which surprised me because I am not a superstitious man, or I was not, and it is a small piece of old glass on a kitchen table in the afternoon, and there is nothing in the world more harmless than that. But I did not want to pick it up. I made myself do it anyway. And I want to be careful here, because I have told this part to a few people over the years, and I can see the moment their trust in me thins, so let me be plain about what did and did not happen. I did not see a ghost. I did not see another face. Nothing moved that should not have moved. What happened was quieter than that, and worse. I looked into that grey old surface, and my reflection was there, dim and far away in the tarnish, and for just a moment, less than a second, I had the absolute bodily certainty that the reflection was not looking back at me, that it was looking at something behind me, that its eyes, my eyes, were focused slightly past my own shoulder, on something in the room with us, and that whatever it was looking at, it had been looking at for a very long time, and was in no hurry at all. And then the second passed, and it was just my face again, tired, a little pale, in a piece of dirty glass. And the widow watched me set it down too quickly, and she did not smile, and she did not say, "I told you so." She just said, "Now you know why I do not keep them on the walls." And she wrapped it back up in the oilcloth, slowly, the way you would settle a fretful animal, and she put it back in the trunk, and she closed the lid, and the room felt different once the lid was closed. Lighter. Like a held breath let go. Because to understand what the widow believed, you have to understand a much stranger and much bigger idea, one that has nothing to do with hollows or ballads, one that many people, right now, believe with total conviction. The idea that the history we were handed is not the whole one, that somewhere in the last few hundred years, something happened, a break, a reset, and that on the far side of that break there was a world, a civilization, that was in some tellings more advanced than the one we live in now, and that this world was, according to the theory, deliberately erased, its buildings reassigned to lesser hands, its accomplishments credited to people who could not possibly have built them, its very name struck from the record until it survived only in the corners, in folklore, in a fragment of grey glass wrapped in oilcloth in a trunk in a hollow. The people who believe this have a name for that lost world. Some of them call it by a name that was once printed, without any controversy at all, on maps that hung in the great houses of Europe. A vast territory sprawling across the top of the world, labelled plainly, for generations, by map-makers who, the believers say, had no reason to invent it. And then, over the span of a few lifetimes, the label thinned, broke into pieces with other names, faded, until school children were taught that region had never really been a single thing at all. A blank, an empty quarter, a place where, so the standard story goes, nothing of great importance ever happened. I am not here to tell you that theory is true. I want to be very clear with you, the way I wish more people would be clear with you. Historians have ordinary, documented answers for nearly all of this. The maps changed for reasons that are written down and dull. That vast label was a geographic convenience, not a hidden empire, and it faded as the land beneath it was mapped in finer detail. The buried ground floors have a plain explanation in the way cities rise over centuries. The grand exhibition palaces were torn down because they were cheaply built and expensive to keep. I am a person who drove into the mountains to record songs. I am not going to rewrite the past for you, and I would be lying to you if I pretended the scholars had no answer. They do. But I sat across a table from a woman holding a piece of grey glass her family had carried across an ocean and guarded for generations, and she connected that glass to the mirror in her bedroom, and the warning from her grandmother, and the flat grey dreams of a dead winter, and the connection she drew was this: that mirrors, real mirrors, the kind that could be doors, were, in her telling, a craft of some older world, and that when that world's memory thinned, the knowledge of what mirrors truly were went with it. But the mirrors themselves stayed, hanging in our houses, facing our beds, doing what they were built to do, quietly, for anyone who forgot to be afraid. Let me tell you what the believers point to, because whether or not you accept the conclusion, the raw material is genuinely strange to sit with, and a good story is honest about that. They point to the buildings. All across the world there are structures we are told were raised by modest, muddy, exhausted people, with hand tools and horse carts, in short spans of time, and yet these structures have a detail and a scale and an ambition that our own age, with all its machines, rarely attempts. Grand halls, vaulted ceilings, stonework cut to tolerances that seem to mock the century they came from. And inside so many of these grand old halls, the believers notice, there are mirrors, enormous mirrors. Mirrors placed with what looks like intention, facing each other down long corridors, set into ballroom walls, positioned in ways that feel, to them, less like decoration and more like plumbing, as if the mirrors were part of how the building worked. They point to the great exhibitions, enormous, ornate, glittering palaces of glass and iron, thrown up for a single season of celebration, and then, we are told, torn back down and carted away. Cities of light that existed for a summer and vanished. And they ask the question that, once you hear it, is hard to unhear. Who builds the most beautiful structure anyone has ever seen, and then demolishes it on purpose a few months later? The honest answer, the documented one, is that a nation eager to show off will spend enormous sums on something temporary, and that these palaces were often built fast and flimsy, and were never meant to last a winter. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. But stand in front of the old photographs, the believers say, and feel the size of what was thrown away, and tell me your certainty does not wobble, just a little, in the dark. They point to the mud, to photograph after photograph of old buildings whose ground floors sit half buried, windows sunk below the level of the street, ornate doorways leading down into the earth, as if the whole world had at some point been flooded not with water but with soil. A wave of mud, they say, that rose up the walls of the old world, and then hardened and became the ground we walk on now. They call these mud floods, and they ask why so many old buildings have a first floor that is underground. The ordinary answer, the true one, is that streets rise over centuries as cities pave over themselves again and again, that ground level in an old city is simply higher than it used to be, and that this is measured and mundane. But stand in front of enough of those sunken windows, they say, and you begin to feel the pull of the other story. The story where something buried the old world in a single terrible season, and the survivors climbed out into the mud and were told, by whoever was left in charge, that it had always been this way, that there had never been anything else, that they should not trouble themselves trying to remember. They point to the empty streets in the oldest photographs, grand boulevards, monumental buildings, cities built at a scale that seems to expect millions, and in the pictures, almost no one. A handful of tiny figures dwarfed by architecture that looks built for a population that is not there. And the believers ask, where did everyone go, or where was everyone yet to come from, and who exactly were these enormous cities built for? The ordinary answer is patient and boring and probably correct, that early photographs required such long exposures that moving people simply did not register, that a busy street would photograph as empty because nothing held still long enough to leave a mark, and that the cities were built ambitiously by people who were betting on growth that did indeed come. But the empty grandeur of those images has a way of getting into you, the sense of a stage set for a crowd that has been quietly removed, And the believers hold those photographs up and say, that is what a world looks like after the memory has been taken out of it. They point to the fires and the resets, to the strange frequency with which whole districts of the old world burned, again and again, the great fires that swept through city after city in the same handful of decades, clearing away the old buildings, they say, so that a newer and smaller story could be built on the ash. And they point to what came after, the institutions that suddenly filled with children whose origins no one could quite account for, the trains that carried the orphaned and the displaced out into a resettling world, and they ask whether a population that has been scattered and orphaned and moved and renamed is not, in the end, exactly a population with its memory cut, a generation raised without grandparents to tell them how the world used to be. The historians will tell you, correctly, that fires were common because cities were built of wood and lit by flame, that orphans were common because disease and poverty were common, that none of it requires a hidden hand. And they are right, and still the believers lay the pieces side by side, the empty cities and the great fires and the scattered children and the faded name on the maps, and they say, look how neatly it all points the same direction, toward a world that was told to forget itself, and did. And that, the widow said, is the part that matters, not the buildings, not the mud, not the fires or the orphans or the empty streets, the forgetting. She said, whatever really happened out there in the wide world, whatever a careful person would or would not believe about it, the thing worth being afraid of is not the cities. It is the ease of losing the memory of them. She said, a people with no memory of their own past will believe anything at all that they are told about it. And she leaned across the table, and she tapped the grey glass, and she said, and how do you take a memory from a whole world at once? You do it the same way you take one from a single sleeping man. You wait until they close their eyes, and you make sure there is something in the room that stays awake. I felt the hair on my arms stand up when she said that, because she had just tied the two halves of it together, and the knot held, the mirror at the foot of the bed and the empire faded from the maps. Both of them, in her telling, the same crime committed at two different scales, the theft of memory from the vulnerable while they sleep, one man in one bedroom, one world in one long night. And the mirror, always the mirror, the thing left facing you in the dark, awake when you are not, patient, watching, waiting for you to forget that it is there. Now I want to talk about how mirrors were actually made, in the world we can document, because even the plain and boring history is stranger than most people realize, and the widow knew a version of it, and her version is not entirely wrong. For most of human history, a good mirror was one of the most difficult and dangerous objects a person could produce. The finest of them, for centuries, were made using a layer of mercury. Craftsmen would lay down a sheet of tin foil, pour liquid mercury across it, and float the glass on top, and the mercury would bind the metal to the glass in a shimmering amalgam that produced a reflection of astonishing clarity, deep and cold and perfect. And the people who made these mirrors did not live long. Mercury is a poison that climbs into the body and settles in the brain, and the mirror makers of the great glass towns were known for trembling hands, for ruined teeth, for a slow unravelling of the mind. They went mad, steadily, predictably, as a cost of the trade. The very clarity of the old mirrors was purchased with the sanity of the people who made them. This part is not folklore. This part is history, written down, provable, grim. And here is the part of the real history that reads like a fairy tale and yet is written down and true. There was, for a very long time, a single place that held the secret of the finest glass in the world, an island where the masters of the craft were gathered together and kept, and the keeping was not gentle. The glassmakers of that island were given honour and comfort and status. Their daughters could marry into noble blood, but they were not permitted to leave. The secret of the glass was worth more than their freedom. It was said that a master who tried to carry the knowledge to a rival country could be hunted down wherever he ran, that the reach of the men who owned the secret was long enough to find a traitor in any city in the world and end him quietly, and that the glassmakers understood this, and stayed and made their beautiful deadly mirrors on their guarded island, poisoning themselves slowly for the benefit of people whose names never went into the furnace with them. A whole craft, sealed off, guarded, its knowledge treated as a thing too dangerous and too valuable to let loose in the world. And when the widow said someone wanted the mirrors more than they wanted the men, she was describing, without knowing the details, something that historians can show you actually happened. The glass was guarded like a weapon. The makers were spent like fuel. And nobody was ever quite allowed to know why the mirrors mattered that much. Sit with that for a moment. To make a perfect reflecting surface, human beings for hundreds of years poisoned their own minds, and the men who profited from it built walls and set watchers to make sure the knowledge could not escape. The mirror was quite literally built out of madness, and the widow knew this, in her own words. She said, "My grandmother told me the good glass drove men crazy to make, and I asked her why anybody would keep making it, and she said, because whoever they were working for wanted mirrors more than they wanted men." That is the part I have never gotten past. Somebody wanted the mirrors badly enough to spend the makers, and the ledgers of who wanted them and why are as thin and grey as the glass itself. And here is where the documented history and the folklore start to rhyme in a way that unsettled me. Because the mercury mirror, the perfect old mirror, the one that cost mines to make, matches the widow's fragment exactly. That grey, heavy, light-holding surface, that is what an old mercury glass looks like when it ages. So when she said this is a piece of a mirror they cannot make anymore, she was, in the most literal and provable sense, correct. We do not make them that way anymore. We stopped, and we were right to stop because it was killing people. The knowledge of how to produce that specific deep, cold reflection at that terrible cost was mostly set down and walked away from, and the old technique survives now only in fragments and in the ruined memory of the towns that used to do it. A real technology, a real, deliberate forgetting, on a small and human scale, exactly the shape of the thing the widow said happened to the whole world. She asked me, that afternoon, whether I had ever wondered why old asylums and old sanatoriums and old hospitals for the troubled mind were so often lined with mirrors, long corridors of them, and I said I had never thought about it. And she said, "Think about it now. A building full of people whose minds have come loose, and on every wall a door." She said her grandmother believed that some of those places were not built to cure anyone, that they were built to gather up the people who had started to remember, who had started to see past the reflection to the room behind it, and to hold them somewhere lined with the very thing that had opened them up, until whatever was on the other side had taken everything it wanted. I have no way to know if that is true. I am fairly sure it is not. But I have every way to know that I did not enjoy hearing it in a cabin at the far end of a hollow as the light went orange in the windows. Let me go back to the husband, because the widow's story did not end with a covered mirror and a relieved silence. There was a coda, and she saved it for last, and she told it flat and plain, the way people tell the things that actually happened, without any of the shape they give to the things they made up. The sheet stayed over the mirror for the rest of that winter, and when the weather broke, her husband, being a practical man, took the whole dresser and the mirror bolted to it out to the barn, meaning to sell it or to break it down for the wood, and it sat in the barn, and she thought that was the end of it. But she said that some nights that spring she would wake and find him gone from the bed, and she would go out to the porch, and she would see the barn door standing open and a light moving around inside, and she never went out to him on those nights. She said she could not have told you why, except that the light did not move the way a man with a lantern moves. It moved the way a man moves who is standing very still in front of something and only turning his head. She said she asked him about it exactly once. She asked him what he was doing out in the barn at night. And he looked at her, this practical man she had known for 40 years, and there was a long pause, too long, and then he said, "I am just checking on it." And she said, "Checking on what?" And he said, "Making sure it is still facing the wall." And then he never mentioned it again, and neither did she, and within the year he was dead. Not violently, not strangely, the doctors would have said. His heart, in his sleep, in the dead hour, at exactly the time he had woken every night that terrible winter. And when she went to clear out the barn after the funeral, the mirror was turned around, facing out, facing the door, facing the house. She did not know who turned it. That is what she told me. She said, I have thought about it every day for a very long time, and I have never once been able to make myself believe that he was the one who turned it around, and I could not ask him. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I covered it, and I buried it, glass down, in the deep woods, and I have never gone back to that spot, and I never will. And I have kept only this one small piece, this fragment, to remind me that the old glass is real, and that whatever we lost in the making of it, we lost on purpose, and that the worst thing you can ever do is forget that any of it is in the room. That is when I understood the pale rectangle on her wall, the place where a mirror used to be and never would be again. She did not keep a single hanging mirror in that house, not one. She had cut her own reflection out of her own home the way you would cut a thorn out of a hand, completely, leaving only the clean scar of unfaded paint where it had been. And she had done it decades ago, and lived all those years since with no reflection at all, rather than sleep one more night in a house where something could look at her while she could not look back. I want to come back, now, to the larger thing, because the widow did, and because the way she did has stayed with me longer than the ghost story. She connected her dead husband in the barn to the whole faded world, and the bridge she built between them was memory, and I've come to think she understood something about memory that the grand theories themselves usually miss, and that the historians, in their own careful way, would not entirely disagree with. Here is the thing about a reset, if you entertain the idea for a moment. It does not actually require armies. It does not require the buildings to be knocked down or the maps to be burned in the street. All it requires is that one generation fail to hand the memory to the next. That is all. Memory is the most fragile thing a civilization owns, more fragile than any wall, because a wall can stand for 1,000 years without anyone tending it, but a memory dies the instant it is not spoken. A single generation that decides not to tell the children, or that is somehow prevented from telling them, or that is simply too tired and too poor and too busy climbing out of the mud of its own hard century, and the past is gone. Not destroyed, just unspoken. And what is unspoken for one lifetime becomes unbelievable in the next, and unimaginable in the one after that. That is not a conspiracy. That is just how forgetting works, and it is the most ordinary and terrifying force in all of human history. And the widow's whole terror, the reason she guarded that fragment and buried that mirror and lived without a reflection, was that she believed she was one of the last people holding one particular thread of memory, and that when she failed to pass it on, it would be gone for good, and that whatever wanted it gone, whether a thing behind the glass or only the ordinary patient darkness of time, was patient enough to simply wait for her to die. That is why she talked to me. I understood it eventually. She did not tell me all of this because I asked about songs. She told me because I had a recorder, and because I was a stranger who would carry it back down out of the hollow and out into the wide forgetting world, and because a memory spoken to one stranger with a recorder has a better chance than a memory that dies in a locked cabin at the end of a road the maps gave up on. She was, in the end, doing the exact opposite of the crime she described. The crime was the theft of memory from the sleeping, and she was placing a memory, carefully, into the hands of someone awake, precisely so that it could not be taken quietly in the night. She was fighting the only way a single old woman in a single hollow can fight against forgetting. She was refusing to forget out loud, to a witness, on tape. I have thought a great deal, since, about why this particular fear, out of all the old fears, has such a grip. Why mirrors? And I think it is because a mirror is the one place in your daily life where you are forced to confront a version of yourself that you do not control. You cannot make the reflection do anything you do not do. But you also cannot make yourself believe, not fully, not in the dark, that it is only ever following. Every human being who has ever stood in a dim room and looked at their own dark reflection has felt, for one animal instant, the certainty that it might not move when they move, that it might just stay and look. And that instant of pure primal doubt is older than any religion, older than any country, older, maybe, than any of the histories we argue about. It might be the oldest fear we have that is entirely our own. The fear that the copy has been waiting, all our lives, very patiently, to stop being the copy. And I keep coming back to the hour. The dead hour, she called it. The hour her husband woke to every night that winter. The hour his heart stopped in the end. There is a real thing there, underneath the folklore, that anyone who has lain awake at that time already knows in their body. The deep middle of the night, long after midnight and long before any hint of morning, is the hour when the ordinary defences of the mind are at their lowest. It is the hour of the worst thoughts, the hour when the fever climbs and the grief bites hardest and the sick most often slip away. Doctors have their explanations for it. The slow tides of the body, the hormones at their ebb, the thin, cold hour when the machine of a person runs closest to stopping. But every culture that ever kept watch through the night arrived at the same instinct without any of the science, that there is an hour when the door between the sleeper and whatever waits stands most easily open, when the self is loosest in its housing, when a person is least themselves and most available. And the widow's whole horror was simply this, that the one object we willingly hang facing us while we lie in that hour, defenceless, unconscious, wide open, is the one object every ancestor we ever had begged us to cover or turn or fear. We put the door at the foot of the bed. And then we spend the most vulnerable hours a human being has, night after night, year after year, asleep in front of it, trusting that the thing on the other side has no more interest in us than we have in it. She did not think that trust was earned. She thought it was simply forgotten, the way everything dangerous is eventually forgotten, right up until the moment it is remembered again, too late, in the dark. And whether or not there was ever a great territory faded from the maps, whether or not the old world was ever buried in a season of mud, whether or not the grand halls were built by hands we have never been properly told about, the widow's smaller claim is one I cannot fully talk myself out of, because I have stood in front of a dark mirror at the dead hour since, and I have felt it, that the reflection knows something you do not, that it remembers something you were made to forget, that it is not, in the deepest sense, on your side. Let me tell you how it ended, my time in that hollow, because the ending is the part I go back to most. I stayed until it was nearly dark, which up there means truly dark. No glow on the horizon, no distant town, just the black shoulders of the ridges against a sky gone deep and cold. And when I finally stood to go, she walked me to the door, and she put her hand on my arm, and she said one last thing, and she said it lightly, almost as an afterthought, which is how the mountains give you the things that are meant to keep you awake. She said, "When you get home tonight, wherever your bed is, go and look at where your mirror hangs, and if it faces where you sleep, do not move it tonight. Wait until the sun is up, because a mirror does not like to be moved after dark. It has spent all day being patient, and moving it in the dark lets it know that you finally noticed. And you do not," she said, "you do not ever want to be the one who moves it in the dark, and lets it know you know on the very same night you have to close your eyes in front of it." I laughed, a little, the way you do, and she did not laugh. She just watched me walk back up the hollow with her youngest thing eyes, and the last I saw of her she was a shape in a lit doorway, with a whole black mountain rising up behind her, and not a single mirror in the house at her back. I drove home through the night, and I got in very late, and my bedroom, in the little rented place I had then, had a tall mirror on the closet door, and it faced the bed. It had faced the bed for 2 years, and I had never once thought about it. And I stood in the doorway at 2 in the morning with my hand on the light switch, and I looked at it, and I looked at the bed, and I did the small, terrible arithmetic on how the reflection was arranged, that if I lay down, the version of me in the glass would be lying down too, in an identical room, at the foot of an identical bed, with the whole night ahead of it, and nothing to do but look across that small, dark distance at the sleeping original and wait. And I want to tell you I moved it. I want to tell you I was brave and rational, and that I took it down that night and leaned it face to the wall and slept like a stone. But her voice was in my ear. "Do not move it in the dark. Do not let it know you finally noticed." And so I did the coward's compromise, the one I suspect most of you would have done too. I slept on the couch. And in the morning, in the full light, with the windows open and the ordinary world running its ordinary noise outside, I took that mirror down, and I have never in my life since hung a mirror where it can see me sleep, and I never will, and if that makes me a foolish man who drove too far into the mountains and let an old woman's grief crawl inside his good sense, then that is what I am, and I will take it, and I will keep sleeping soundly, which is more than I can say for the practical people. Because here is the last thing, the thing underneath all of it, The thing I have come to believe she was really trying to hand me across that table. It does not actually matter whether the mirror is a door. It does not matter whether there was ever a great empire faded from the maps, or a wave of mud that buried the old world, or a craft of glass and mercury, and forgetting that we were never meant to lose. What matters is that she was right about the mechanism, that the way you take something precious from a person, or from a family, or from a whole civilization, is nearly always the same. You wait until they are not paying attention. You wait until they are tired and comfortable and sure that they already know the whole story. You wait until they have stopped watching the thing in the room that never stops watching them. And then, quietly, in the dead hour, it is gone. And in the morning the story simply says it was always this way, that there was never anything else, that they should not trouble themselves trying to remember. The widow's whole life was a refusal of that. A single old woman in a single hollow, guarding one fragment of grey glass and one impossible story, staying awake, on purpose, against a darkness patient enough to outlast almost everyone. And she is gone now. The librarian told me, a few years after, that she had died, alone, in that cabin at the end of the road. And I asked, because I had to, I asked whether anyone had found a mirror in the house. And there was a pause on the line, and the librarian said, "No, not one, but they found something strange. On the wall of the bedroom, where a mirror would hang, on that clean rectangle of unfaded paint, someone, at some point, had written across it, in pencil, in a shaking hand, 2 words. And I already knew, before she said them, because I had seen those same 2 words in that same pencil at the bottom of a list a long time before. I already knew what the widow had left, facing the place where she slept, in the last dark of that hollow, so that whoever came after would understand exactly what she had spent her life doing. She wrote, "Still watching." And I think about her every single night, in the moment before I turn off the light, in the little ritual I have kept ever since, when I look at the wall where no mirror hangs and I say, quietly, to the empty room, and to her, and to whatever else might be listening, I remember. I remember. I have not forgotten, and I never will. That is the story the widow of the hollow gave me, in exchange for songs I never got around to recording. And I have carried it a long way down out of those old, old mountains, and I have set it here, awake, in front of you, so that it cannot be taken quietly in the night. So do with it what she did. Do not let it sleep. Do not let it be forgotten. And whatever else you do, tonight, before you close your eyes, go and look at where your mirror hangs, and ask yourself which one of you, really, has been leading all this time, and which one has only been very, very patiently learning to follow. And if you lie there in the dark and feel it watching, do not look away in fear. Say her 2 words back to it, quietly, and mean them, still watching. Make sure that it is you,